Hey guys, what are you doing right now? Today, we're going to slowly unpack something that's been happening in the world that most people have heard about, but very few fully understand. We're going to look at the unfolding of a particular situation not for its dramatic impact, but for its intricate procedural layers, the fragmented information that surrounds it, and the persistent questions that have lingered long after the initial headlines faded. It's a study in institutional communication, regulatory oversight, and the often complex journey of information from discovery to public disclosure. Our focus today is on the extended aftermath of a significant data compromise that involved a prominent global social media platform. The initial reports emerged not from the platform itself, but through independent security researchers and subsequent media investigations. These early signals, appearing a few years ago, hinted at an exposure of user data on a scale that was, at the time, unprecedented for such a widely used service. Public awareness began with fragmented reports suggesting that personal details of millions of users might have been made accessible without authorization. When these initial reports surfaced, the platform issued its first public statements. These communications, often brief and carefully worded, acknowledged an incident and stated that an internal investigation was underway. The language typically emphasized the platform's commitment to user security and promised transparency as more details became available. Expectations were set that a clear picture would eventually emerge regarding the scope of the breach, the number of affected individuals, and the specific types of data that might have been compromised. This initial phase of information dissemination was characterized by a sense of urgency, coupled with the inherent limitations of an ongoing, internal review process. However, as weeks turned into months, the clarity that many had anticipated began to recede, replaced instead by a series of evolving disclosures and procedural complexities. The initial estimate of affected users, for example, was revised upwards, not once, but multiple times, with each new figure significantly expanding the scope of the exposure. The types of data initially believed to be at risk, such as email addresses and phone numbers, were later confirmed to include a broader range of personal identifiers, extending the perceived impact. These revisions, while presented as part of an ongoing investigatory process, naturally led to questions about the completeness of the initial assessments and the methodologies employed in determining the breach's full extent. Central to many of these unfolding questions was the precise timeline surrounding the platform's awareness and subsequent notification. When exactly did the platform become aware of the full extent of the intrusion, and how did this awareness translate into the subsequent formal notification process, both to regulatory bodies and to the public? This specific procedural moment, the precise timing of discovery versus disclosure, became a recurring point of inquiry. Regulatory frameworks in various jurisdictions, notably the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, and similar mandates elsewhere, often stipulate strict timelines for notifying authorities and affected individuals after a data breach is detected. The platform's adherence to, or deviation from, these timelines would become a critical subject of regulatory scrutiny. As the situation evolved, the procedural delays and partial disclosures became more pronounced. Government bodies and regulatory agencies across continents, including those responsible for consumer protection and data privacy, initiated their own formal inquiries. These investigations often involved demands for internal documents, detailed timelines, and forensic reports from the platform. The platform, in turn, often invoked legal privileges, commercial sensitivities, or the ongoing nature of its internal investigations to justify the partial redaction or delayed release of certain requested materials. This created a fragmented informational landscape where complete official narratives were rare, and piecemeal disclosures often arrived after significant intervals. Media coverage, initially focused on the raw facts of the breach, gradually shifted to explore these procedural ambiguities. Reports began to highlight discrepancies between internal corporate communications that occasionally surfaced and the more generalized public statements. Analysts and privacy advocates pointed to the protracted nature of the regulatory response, noting that while fines were eventually levied by various authorities, the processes leading to these penalties often spanned years. The actual calculation of these fines, the methodologies used, and the settlement negotiations themselves were often shrouded in procedural confidentiality. further contributing to a sense of opacity for the general public seeking clear accountability. This brings us back to that crucial procedural point: the exact timeline of discovery and notification. The regulatory bodies, in their eventual public pronouncements and fine impositions, frequently reference the platform's purported delay in notifying authorities after it had supposedly become aware of the full scope of the incident. Yet the specific evidence or internal corporate records that informed these regulatory conclusions were rarely made fully public. Instead, summaries or heavily redacted reports became the primary public-facing documents. This created a curious situation where the justification for a regulatory action, a failure in prompt notification, was publicly stated, but the precise details supporting that critical timeline often remained within the confines of legal and investigatory privilege. In similar situations involving large-scale institutional failures or data compromises, the standard protocol often involves a relatively swift, clear, and comprehensive public statement outlining the facts, the known impact, and the steps being taken. While investigations are always dynamic, there's an expectation of a foundational set of undisputed facts presented early on. In this particular case, however, the narrative unfolded more like a slow, deliberate archaeological dig, with new layers of information being uncovered, debated, and revised over an extended period. The procedural dance between corporate disclosure, regulatory demands, and legal challenges seem to dictate the pace and completeness of the public's understanding. What continues to remain unclear are the fine-grained specifics of the platform's internal decision-making process during the critical period when the breach was first detected and subsequently assessed. What exactly was known, by whom, and when that led to the initial public statements being significantly revised later. How did the internal legal and communication teams navigate the complex web of international reporting requirements when the understanding of the breach was still in flux? And what precise mechanisms or triggers were at play that ultimately led the platform to revise its estimates of affected users upwards, sometimes by many millions, months after its initial declarations? These are not questions of guilt or intent, but rather procedural questions about the flow of information within a global institution and its responsibilities to regulatory bodies and the public. The numerous legal actions initiated by affected users across different jurisdictions also contributed to this fractured informational landscape. Court filings and discovery processes occasionally brought forth new documents or testimonies, sometimes contradicting earlier public statements or regulatory findings. Yet these legal proceedings, often lengthy and complex, rarely culminated in a single definitive public record that comprehensively addressed all outstanding procedural questions. Instead, settlements or ongoing litigation kept many details from reaching a clear and transparent conclusion. And so, we are left with a situation where the initial event, a significant data compromise, is widely acknowledged. Yet the procedural journey of understanding that event, from its discovery to the fragmented and often delayed disclosures, remains largely ambiguous. The precise timeline of awareness, the full details of internal responses, and the complete justification for the evolving public statements continue to be pieced together from various, sometimes conflicting, sources. The institutional processes that govern this slow release of information, and the points at which clarity was either withheld or simply difficult to ascertain, continue to be a subject of ongoing, if quiet,